Every human culture on Earth classifies organisms in some way. The classification system may simply group life forms into plants or animals, or it could group them as dangerous or edible. It could group them by size, or by their use, or by habitat. Another way to group organisms, the way that we'll learn about in class today, uses their ancestry or evolutionary relationships. Here are your learning objectives. This slide includes 11 fairly diverse animals. Take a moment to think about how you would group these animals. How many groups would you make? What traits would you use to place each animal in its group? Sometimes we group animals together because of similar traits. So you might group all the animals with fins together, or the animals that stand on 2 legs, or those with no legs. See what you can do. In one culture of the past, this beaver was placed in the group as a fish for some good reasons. The tail looks scaly like a fish, and it spends much of its time underwater. This is the barnacle goose. The geese were thought to emerge from shellfish, or from trees that fell into the water. Part of the reason was their appearance, part of it was a mystery around their breeding, and part of the reason was that if the goose was considered a plant or some kind of fish, it could be eaten on days when meat was forbidden. If you think of these examples as silly, consider all the people today who think of a mushroom as a plant. Around the 1750s, Carl Linnaeus created his version of taxonomy. He was a botanist and did very well at grouping plants. He did this by looking at their reproductive structures, their flowers. This ended up matching very well with evolutionary relationships because the ability to reproduce with a similar organism is an important aspect of evolution. Linnaeus is credited, though he was certainly not the first, with binomial nomenclature, the practice of giving each species a 2-word name that is unique and agreed upon by scientists around the world so that everyone can communicate with each other. Linnaeus is also credited with hierarchical classification, which we'll cover in just a moment. Another way of grouping species is through phylogeny. This approach uses molecules like proteins or DNA rather than specific traits. Modern phylogeny began around the 1980s and has been making biology instructors and students miserable ever since by changing all the evolutionary trees around. The use of DNA is considered to be the best approach of determining evolutionary ancestry and evolutionary relationships. But there are some disagreements and problems with this approach, which we won't get into that much in this class, but I encourage you to take my Animal Diversity and Phylogeny course, ZO 350. It's a lot of fun. Many of the Linnaean classification concepts are still used today, including hierarchical classification, from broad, all-encompassing groups to small, exclusive groups, or taxa. A taxon is just a group at any level. If we do a quick little doodle, small specific groups, like these, can be placed in larger and larger groupings. So if I asked which letter would represent the most similar organism to the letter A, you should be able to identify D as the most similar or most related. In taxonomy, the largest level, like this large circle, is the most general group, the domain. The most specific group is a species. Every life form we know of is placed into a certain set of these taxa. I do want you to know the names of these different levels and their order so that you can identify that 2 species in the same genus are more closely related than 2 species that only share the same kingdom. Luckily, there are many mnemonic devices for taxonomic levels, My favorite, and the one I still remember from my introductory biology class, is, did King Philip come over from Germany Saturday? You can find others online, or you can make up your own and have some fun with it. We're going to focus on the domains and kingdoms today, the most general taxa. Domains are so broad that there are only 3 domains for all life on Earth. These are bacteria, archaea, and eukaryota. These domains are identified by extremely basic cell structures that I've symbolized here. If we first look at these 2 smaller types of cells, bacteria and archaea, these are both prokaryotic, meaning that they have no nucleus or no subcellular compartments. Bacteria and archaeans differ slightly in their DNA, so I use different colors to indicate that these are slightly different. They both have the same type of DNA, but there are tiny differences in some related proteins. Both bacteria and archaeans have slightly different cell membranes and slightly different proteins that stick out along the outer edge of the membrane, again shown by these different colors. It's currently thought that about 2 to 3 billion years ago, an archaean cell and a bacterial cell combined to form the first eukaryotic cell. You can see that the DNA is more similar to the archaean, the membranes are more similar to the bacteria, and the outer proteins are more similar to the archaean, so it's a mix. The defining trait of eukaryotic cells, though, is the presence of subcellular organelles like a nucleus. These organelles are compartments that protect substances inside or allow chemical reactions to be isolated. And that's it. Every life form on Earth is made of one of these 3 types of cells. Here's a super hard question. Which domain are you in? Answer: you are a eukaryote. Our cells have a nucleus and other organelles inside. I also included option D here because many students think that prokaryota is a domain. It makes sense because it's the alternative to eukaryotic cells, but this is not a domain. Remember, both bacteria and archaeans are prokaryotic. Make sure you understand how each of these words relates to each other. If we go inside one of the 3 domains, let's look inside domain eukaryota. Now we can look at the different kingdoms inside this one domain. These kingdoms are differentiated by how the cells acquire food. The plant kingdom generally undergoes photosynthesis. The animal kingdom ingests other organisms by taking them inside the cell or the body, breaking them down, and then dispersing nutrients from within. Fungi grow through their food, digesting it outside the body and just absorbing the nutrients from outside. You may have learned of a 4th kingdom, the protists. This actually is not a kingdom, but we'll cover them more when we get into detailed biodiversity later this semester. These next few slides are simply to provide an example of different taxonomic levels. So we'll dive into one group at each taxonomic level. Currently, we're inside domain eukaryota with the cells that have a nucleus. Now we've moved down into a more specific taxon, kingdom Animalia, which includes organisms that take food into their body to break down nutrients. Within kingdom Animalia, we have many different phyla. There are currently about 35. These include sponges and jellyfish, many phyla of worms, mollusks, arthropods, chordates, and echinoderms like starfish. I've underlined phylum Chordata because it's the group we'll dive into next. Take a moment, though, to look at these organisms and see how different they all appear. As we look at more and more specific taxa, the organisms will start looking much more similar because they're much more closely related. Within phylum Chordata, we have about 8 different classes. Multiple classes of fish, some invertebrate chordates, amphibians, class Sauropsida, which includes the reptiles and birds, and class Mammalia. Next, we'll look inside class Mammalia. Now we're down to different orders. These are many groups of mammals like rabbits, rodents, carnivores, primates, cetaceans, and ungulates. These are whales and hoofed mammals like deer and rhinos. Bats, elephants, and more. Before we move on, let's review. What's the next taxonomic level we'll look at inside order primates? Inside the primate order, we have different families of primates. Lemurs, Old World monkeys, New World monkeys, and apes. Next, we'll look inside the family of apes, but look how similar all these animals appear now. These are our very close relatives. Inside the family of apes, there are 4 different genera: Pongo, the orangutans, gorilla, Pan, which are the chimpanzees and bonobos, and humans. The most specific group we'll cover is the species. If we look inside genus Homo, and by the way, this means of organic soil. The word human comes from the same root word as humus, which is a soil layer that's rich in organic content. Since we name ourselves human or Homo, it also means the same, like the same as us. Our species name or specific epithet is sapiens, which means wise and refers to our large cranium. That's us, Homo sapiens. There were other species within the human genus, like Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, Homo habilis, and Homo ergaster, are just a few examples of extinct human species. You've probably heard of our species name, Homo sapiens. This is a scientific name in the format of binomial nomenclature. Nomenclature means a naming system, and binomial means 2 words. Each species gets a 2-word name that is the combination of the genus group and the species group. The genus is always capitalized, and the species name is lowercase. The 2 words together are italicized to indicate that it's in a different language, usually Latin. You're probably familiar with a couple scientific names like Tyrannosaurus rex or Escherichia coli, more commonly known as E. coli. And there are some fun ones here like the dinosaur Dracorex hogwartsia, which looks like a Hogwarts dragon, and Jelly Belly, which is this beetle named by some scientists being goofy. Scientists use scientific names because they're unique to each species, they're the same names anywhere in the world, so it makes communication easier, and in general, when it's named, it's permanent. There are some exceptions to this if taxonomic groupings need to be changed. Common names work for common organisms in local areas, but a lot of times names can refer to many different species. An example is the robin. Here in America, the American robin is a member of the thrush group, whereas the European robin is an entirely different family of birds. The Australasian robin is in yet another family of birds, so referring to these all as robins is very confusing. Let's take a quick look at the Australasian robin's Wikipedia page to see its taxonomic hierarchy. Here's our adorable little robin, and for any species you look up on Wikipedia, they will have the scientific classification. So we're inside kingdom Animalia, phylum Chordata, class Aves, which is the birds, and then order Passeriformes, superorder Corvoidea, And then down into this family, the gender is a little confusing, so there's information about that in the text. Another problem with common names is that it's more difficult to use with different languages. Scientific names are all pretty much in Latin, and since it's a dead language, the words don't change their meaning. Another issue is that some species, like this brown moth, are so blah that it's unlikely to have a distinct name. And this deep sea creature has no common name either. It's not common, so no common name. Most organisms known only from fossils also don't have common names, since people don't interact with them. This roly-poly has the problem of too many common names. It's a roly-poly, a pill bug, some people call it a potato bug or woodlouse or sow bug, which are names actually applied to some insects as well. And different languages also use different words, of course. So scientific names can simplify all these issues. You can also use scientific names to determine which species are most closely related to each other. What do we think of these 4 primates? Pan troglodytes, Pan paniscus, Ateles paniscus, and Homo sapiens. Which 2 are most closely related, determined simply from their scientific names? The chimp, Pan troglodytes, and the bonobo, Pan paniscus, are most closely related because they are in the same genus. I threw this Ateles paniscus in to emphasize that the species name, the specific epithet, is pretty random. It's like you can have a bunch of people named Bob, but they're not related. It's the last name that might help place people with their relatives. So scientific names are kind of like putting the last name first. Here's the taxonomic hierarchy for each of these species. You can see they're all identical down to order primates. Then this spider monkey separates out in a different family, the family of New World monkeys. So that's the most distantly related to the rest of us. We're all in the family of apes. Now let's take a moment to think about what a species is. Consider these 9 common names and see if you can figure out which ones, if any, are species. If you said duck, there are over 100 species of ducks. There are 2 living species of elephants. This is also a reminder that there are many, many species of these groups that have gone extinct, like the steppe mammoth, pygmy mammoth, or American mastodon. There are over 5,000 species of ladybugs. And if you thought for sure it was the hagfish, there are about 100 species of these animals, famous for their massive release of slime as a defense mechanism. So there were actually no species on that list. Each of those groups of animals were at a much more general taxonomic level. Here's a hint. Species, even common names, generally include 2 or more words, like European robin instead of robin, capuchin monkey rather than monkey, polar bear rather than bear, and instead of hagfish, there is the Pacific hagfish, inshore hagfish, broad-gilled hagfish, lakeside hagfish, Galapagos hagfish, and so on. Most of us think of organisms at what level if we talk about something like a turtle, monkey, or duck? We know it's not going to be genus and species because we just talked about how species are much more specific than the groups listed. And you know it's not a domain or kingdom because that would be something like eukaryote and then animal. That's too general. So it's either going to be order and family or phylum and class. Phylum is still pretty big. It's things like chordates and nematodes. Orders and families are more specific groups like monkeys, turtles, cats, and butterflies. As scientists, we need to understand biodiversity in much more detail. If you think we have biodiversity because there's a monkey, a butterfly, and some moss, that's missing a massive number of species. We'll begin our next lecture with a little bit more information about what a species is and how species evolve. and then compare that with populations, which is where the real action is in terms of ecology. Have a great day. I'll see you next time.